Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, there are international calls for Mali to transition to civilian rule as soon as possible. Following talks with regional mediators, the junta that ousted President IBK last week says it's hoping for a 3-year post-coup transition before elections. Also, campaigning's kicked off in Tanzania ahead of October's polls that have already led to opposition claims of persecution. And a perfect balance. More Cameroonian farmers are using fish to cultivate their crops as more invest in aquaponics in the hope that the symbiotic system can help boost output. But first, the global body of French-speaking countries has temporarily suspended Mali's membership, and the EU has suspended training missions in the country in the wake of last week's coup. There are international calls for Mali to transition to civilian rule as soon as possible. The junta that ousted President IBK told negotiators from regional bloc ECOWAS on Wednesday that they're hoping for a 3-year transition period before elections. Nicolas Chemin has more.
This meeting between Mali's opposition and the junta was inevitable. Since June, the M5 RFP protesters had been calling for the resignation of President Keita. He was toppled last week when top military officials arrested him. On Wednesday after the meeting, the opposition was keen to stress all that it has in common with the junta.
Le CNSP a parachevé de la plus belle manière la lutte héroïque du peuple malien portée par le M5 RFP. À partir de ce moment, le M5 RFP et le CNSP demeurent les deux acteurs clés du changement.
The opposition also called on the military to resist outside pressure but did not give details. The junta has in recent days received several ambassadors and the head of Barkhane, the French anti-jihadist military force in the Sahel region. ECOWAS, the regional bloc, said it wanted a transition that should not last more than a year. So far, no agreement has been reached with the soldiers. But a diplomat who has attended the meetings told France 24 that it was highly likely an agreement would take place in the coming days. According to analysts, this junta appears far more organized and disciplined than the one that toppled former President Amadou Toumani Touré in 2012.
Well, campaigning's kicked off in Tanzania ahead of a general election that's already led to opposition claims of persecution. Originally hailed as a reformer of the last 5 years, President John Magufuli has been accused of increasingly stifling dissent and cracking down on press freedoms. Regional correspondent Mikelwa Shachwayo has more.
Campaigning for the upcoming elections in October got underway in Tanzania today. Various political parties campaigned in their constituencies. President John Magufuli seeking re-election after coming into power in 2015. Initially, he was seen as a reformist, and now he's seen as someone who is divisive in the country. There's been a crackdown on government critics, a restriction of media spaces, civic spaces, as well as an arrest of journalists. Controversially, in June, the president said that COVID-19 could be defeated with a prayer. Opposition leader Zito Kabwe criticized the president on his response to COVID-19. He was arrested. International organizations such as Amnesty said that this was proof of a growing crackdown on government critics. The main opposition, Chadema, is expected to go head-to-head with Magufuli. However, experts believe that Magufuli will win unless political opposition form a coalition. Now, even though campaigning has gone ahead in Tanzania today, a political opposition are concerned that the political climate in the country does not make it conducive for free and fair elections.
Mikelwa Shachwayo there for us. Now, the US has offered to remove Sudan from its state sponsors of terrorism list in exchange for a $330 million compensation payment to American victims of al-Qaeda. Sudan's been on the list since 1993 because of past support for the extremist group. The country's new reformist transitional government wants an end to the sanctions that come with being on that terror list. Now, the issue was raised as US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo met with Prime Minister Hamdok during a flying visit to Khartoum on Tuesday. Pompeo also encouraged Sudan to normalize relations with Israel. Hamdok has said that question should remain separate to the issue of Sudan's removal from the terror list. Earlier, I asked Sudan Affairs Specialist Dr. Eric Reeves about why Hamdok would think that re-examination of Sudan's status would be affected by its relationship with Israel.
I think it's important to remember that the U.S. is in the midst of an election, and Secretary of State Pompeo could not possibly take Sudan off the state sponsor of terrorism list so long as it refuses to pay victims of the 1998 bombings. The question about the relationship between Sudan and Israel is more complicated. The Trump administration believes, foolishly, I think, that it has something that might be called a Middle East peace plan for Israel and Arab countries and the Palestinians. Israel is desperate to get another Arab state, which it considers Sudan to be, and Pompeo undoubtedly, though we don't know exactly how, pressured Hamdok to accede to the U.S. request that Israel be recognized formally by the government of Sudan. Hamdok heads a transitional government, and he insists that such a decision should be made by the government when it transitions fully to a civilian state.
Now, it's been 17 years since Sudan was first put on that list. Why now in particular is it important for the country to be removed from it?
We need to remember that Sudan is in the midst of an economic collapse, catastrophic financial, economic conditions throughout the country, huge external indebtedness, an inability to import sufficient food, fuel, medicine. There's approximately $2 billion in hard currency in the central bank of Sudan. There's no way that Sudan can pay the amount of money it's agreed to pay, but it will certainly say so in order to be removed from the state sponsor of terrorism list, which will enable huge infusions of international loan money.
So Sudan and Israel have been technically at war for decades now. Israel's keen for that to change, but why is the US so invested in patching up these countries' relationship?
Again, I think it gets back to the need for the Trump administration to have what it considers a diplomatic victory. And if Sudan recognizes Israel, will join several other Arab states and will make it appear as though only Syria and a couple other countries are holding out. And there's a divided opinion in Sudan itself. I think most people don't really care about the issue. Some opposition parties, the Umma Party, the Arab Party, are opposed to recognizing Israel. But others, pragmatists we might call them, know that this is important to the United States, so it has to be important to Sudan.
Dr. Eric Reeves there speaking to me a little early on. And of course, it's 27 years since Sudan was placed on that US terror list, not 17. Moving on, in other news, supporters of former Ivorian President Laurent Gbagbo have said that they're going to file his candidacy for October's election, despite him having been struck off the electoral list last week. Gbagbo lives in Brussels, and his return to national politics would be highly sensitive. He was freed conditionally by the International Criminal Court after he was cleared in 2019 of crimes against humanity. Rwanda's asked France to extradite a suspect in the country's 1994 genocide. Major General Alois Tiwiragabo is a former head of Rwanda's military intelligence service, who was recently discovered as living just outside of Paris. The 71-year-old is the subject of an international arrest warrant and is believed to have been one of the architects of the slaughter of more than 800,000 ethnic Tutsis and the Hutus who tried to protect them. More Cameroonian farmers are investing in aquaponics in the hope of getting more crops and more fish. The system relies on creating a symbiotic environment for the two, and the integrated method can yield big rewards. Our team went to meet one engineer selling specialist kits in Douala.
Demand for produce sold by vendors at this market in Douala is high. Producers are constantly looking at ways to get ahead in the race to supply the fast-growing population with affordable staples. One clean and green farming method gaining ground in Cameroon is aquaponics. This is the man trying to popularize the system locally. The technique combines the breeding of fish and growing plants without soil. Boris Yudum designs the kits used. Fish excrement nourishes plants, which in turn purify the water used for aquaculture. The result, more crops, 100% organic, without fertilizers or pesticides.
Dans le système aquaponique, vous pouvez produire plus de 5 fois plus qu'au sol. On ne met aucun produit chimique. C'est une agriculture bio parce que là, si vous mettez les produits aux poissons, ça tue les plantes. Si vous mettez les produits sur les plantes, ça tue les poissons.
In Douala, thousands have invested in this method of urban farming. Vanessa has installed an aquaponics kit at home and sells her produce. She invested 400 euros into her business and has already seen profit.
Je suis à la 3e récolte de menthe et de curcuma. Mais pour le poisson, c'est ça qui va véritablement me rapporter de l'argent.
A few kilometers away, Vanessa goes to supply fish to a new customer. The restaurant owner has been buying from her for the last 6 months.
Comment tu vas?
Angel says it's cheaper buying aquaponics produce.
Les clients aiment vraiment ça parce que c'est frais, c'est bio et c'est le poisson qui me donne beaucoup plus d'argent. Depuis que je prends ce poisson, le poisson chevané, ça, les clients, j'ai beaucoup de clients qui viennent.
Those who've invested in aquaponics are hoping it will continue to grow in popularity and make a big impact in a country that still imports more than 50% of its food.
Well, that's it for Eye on Africa. Thanks for joining us. Do so again. Take care.